Hi guys, and welcome to Not Just Business. I'm your host, Derek Peed, and I'm privileged to have as guest speaker today, Peter Thomas, one of the top facilitators in South Africa and perhaps even in the world. I know this because I've used him to facilitate strategic planning workshops for several of the companies and business units I've been involved in over the years, and he always delivers. Today we'll find out what and how he delivers. So Peter, you've had a large number of the top 100 companies in South Africa as clients over the years, and you facilitated strategic planning sessions for the top executives of those companies and run hundreds of ad hoc workshops for various groups. You've also been a bit of a serial entrepreneur in your own right. What is it about facilitating a group of people that excites you?
I think it really has to revolve around getting a result for the client. When the client is excited at the end of a workshop, that's really what turns you on and what makes you feel this is really worthwhile doing.
And what sort of things would result in the client being excited?
I guess if you think about the process, that the starting point is always what is the end result you're trying to achieve. And as long as I'm absolutely clear what it is that the client wants as an end result, then it's fairly easy to work back from that and say, okay, how do I now structure the agenda and what questions do I need to ask to get us to that result? The thing that probably most people are unaware of is how powerful the wisdom of groups are. That people, if you give them the opportunity and you ask them the right questions, they will always know the answers. And it's incredible. What amazes me when I run these workshops is we'll get all of this information out. And the process of facilitation is quite simple, really. It is ask the question, get the respondents to feed back to you, then play it back to them, what they've told you.
Yeah.
What they find absolutely unbelievable is how the story unfolds, and what they don't realize is their own information that's simply being played back to them. That's the beauty of it.
Now, I've always maintained that 90% of what you need to radically improve a business lives in the heads of the people already working there.
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
And your job as a leader, and in your case a facilitator, is to get it out of their heads and onto paper. The leader's job is to add in the other 10%, to make the decisions, decide on the actions.
And then encourage the implementation.
Yeah. I know you use a system called Participlan. Tell us about that and what makes it so effective.
It's actually a very interesting story. At the end of the last war in Germany, a man called Eberhard Schneller was so devastated at what Hitler had done, and he did some research and examined why was it that Hitler could sway a crowd with his oratory skills and the way he expressed himself. And he realized that it wasn't only Hitler, but there were a lot of people doing it, which is why autocratic businesses emerged, because a CEO would stand up and say, "This is what I want you to do, end of story, do it." And of course, didn't get any input from the participants in the meeting. And so Schneller said to himself, how do I solve that problem? Because it's not going to work in the kind of world we live in today. And he said, the alternative to the spoken word is the written word. And he said, but the problem with the written word, if you use something like a flip chart, it's too linear. You can't work with the information. So that's why he came up with this concept. Well, if you get people to write on special stationery, and you can then shuffle that stationery, so you do a number of things. One, you can let the ideas come out absolutely randomly. You also don't know whose idea is which when it's coming out. And what you do is you paste them onto a set of boards so that they come out into clusters of ideas. And the group direct how the clusters are formed. They will say, this idea goes with that cluster, for instance. And very quickly, you have this entire picture. And in fact, because the process is so effective and you don't get duplication and repeating of yourself, the process takes half the time of a normal meeting.
Yes, I've noticed that. As I said, I have had a few sessions with you. And we always come out with an action plan, not an action plan, a set of strategies and a set of action plans to go with each strategy. And I've often, before your time being in strategic planning meetings, that just drag on and on and on. I was in one, in fact, that I remember quite well. We discussed the wording of a mission statement over 3 days. And that was the board and the top management of the company together. And we couldn't reach agreement on the wording of a mission statement. It boggles the mind. So I've also always maintained that if you manage a large or a small group of people, you don't need to have all the answers. In fact, you can't. I've run a large insurance company and we had a few hundred people in IT. I didn't have the foggiest idea what either of them did, but technically I was responsible for them. So while you don't need to have all the answers, you certainly do need to know some good questions. How important are questions, and how do you decide which questions to ask of the group?
So I mentioned a little earlier that one of the key reference points is understanding what the end result is that the client is trying to achieve. Once you know what that end result is, then it's not too difficult to work back from that and say, well, if we want a set of action plans, we need to arrive at some decisions. To arrive at some decisions, we need to have some goals that we're shooting for. To achieve the goals, we need to know what's working and what's not working in order to get there. So that kind of gives you the questions that you need to be asking to get to that end result. And the questions simply have to be open-ended questions. So you never ask a question that is closed, where someone could answer yes or no. So it's always got to be a question where they've got to think about it and express an opinion on the issue. And of course, one of the tricks with questions is don't ask a question that has too serious a qualifier in it. So for instance, one day, that's one that really struck me because I had a big group that I was running a workshop for. And I said, what are all of the creative ways you can think of to use a fax machine? Just by putting in that word creative, nobody could think of one idea. Every idea they thought of, well, I could send out an invite to my girlfriend. But, oh, hold on, that's not very creative. And so they just scrapped the idea. So be careful of not putting in some qualifier that they make a judgment on.
And now when people are writing on these cards and sticking them on the board, you might get something really controversial. And because they can't be identified, somebody might say something like, the MD is an absolute a-hole.
Yes.
How do you deal with that?
The first most important rule of facilitate is understanding that the audience are number one. They are the most important people. So I have had those situations. They've arisen from time to time. And in fact, I had one where 3 cards came out of a group of about 15 saying, fire the MD. And the MD was sitting in the middle of the group. So of course he leapt up and said, wow, what am I doing that's causing a problem? And as a facilitator, I can't just blunder in and handle it. I had to stop and say to him as an MD, do you want us to unpack that? And he said yes. And then I said to the group, do you want us to unpack this issue? And they said yes. Then it was simply a matter of posing another question, which was, what is the MD doing that's causing a problem? And then everyone wrote cards, and it was a very safe way of now unpacking the issues with the MD. He looked at them and said, wow, I didn't realize I was doing those things. I'll change my ways. Whether he does or not, of course, is a totally different issue. But the key was it was a very safe way to identify what the MD was doing that he could improve.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the MD had to have the emotional intelligence to want to explore it further.
Absolutely, absolutely. But that's the important point that you're making there. The facilitator has to make sure that that's comfortable. You, as a facilitator, can't blunder in and just start unpacking it.
So how do you keep a group on track when they seem to be going all over the show, as management teams invariably do? Side conversations, or somebody wants to discuss something in the middle of your process and rattles everybody's cage and yours as well, I suppose. How do you deal with that?
You pick up quite quickly who the people are who are wanting to fight the system. And what I invariably do is I will go and have a chat to them quietly if they're causing a disturbance. Or alternatively, I will simply explain the rules again and say, this is about everyone having a say, everyone's ideas being expressed and coming onto the boards, and then we evaluate the ideas. But what I have found in real terms is that because the process is so engaging, because everybody's sitting and thinking and writing, you get very little stuff happening on the side causing a disturbance. And in fact, I recently ran a workshop for a government department, and the chairman pulled me aside before the workshop and said, I need to tell you the union are attending this meeting. They have told me already that they don't think we should be doing this. They're going to toy throughout the meeting. I said, well, I'll have to manage that as it arises. To this day, I cannot tell you who the union members were because not a single person stood up and toy-toyed. They became so involved and so engrossed in what was coming out that it wasn't a problem at all.
So do you often get that where somebody in the group, if it was a normal facilitation process, they would probably do most of the talking. With your system, they're restricted to writing on cards. Do you get people trying to hijack the agenda to get the answers that they want on the board?
Yes, absolutely, you do. In fact, the easiest way of doing it, and a good facilitator puts the responsibility of that time control on the audience, on the people who are participating. So we have a rule called 30-second rule. And no one should speak for more than 30 seconds. Now, the reason why we choose 30 seconds is because if you think about it, all the ads you hear on radio, on TV, they're all about 30 seconds long. So you've got very clever people pitching and building a message, which they then beam at an audience. And so as audiences, we're saying, if you want me to listen, you better be short, sharp, and to the point. So what we do is we explain the rule right up front. And we then say to the delegates in the room, please write 30 on a card. And if one of your delegates, one of your colleagues starts taking over the meeting and getting onto their soapbox, just take that 30-second card, wave it in front of them, and you'll be amazed at how quickly they can paraphrase what they have to say. And that's one of the techniques that we use.
Part of the job of a facilitator is to play devil's advocate, I suppose. I'm imagining, and you can correct me, that when you see people going down routes which you know to be stupid, because you've seen other companies do that, you might say, hang on, guys, what about this? What about that? How does playing devil's advocate work?
So I, at one stage, was running as many as 100 facilitations a year, and now semi-retired and running probably about 40 to 50 a year. So I have a lot of experience across all industries, from engineering to finance to the arts, you name it, to government, to small business. And one of the things you do very quickly pick up is what the common elements are in business that's interfering. And one of the key things that's probably hobbles most businesses is communication. People don't understand what's got to happen in the business, or there's friction in the business. And rather than my saying, wow, hold on, stop a minute, I want to just tell you about an idea that you can employ that will solve this problem, I have to ask a series of questions. So I'll say, is this a really serious problem? And I'll ask them, how does this manifest itself? What are the sort of things that happen? And I'll get them to explore it. And then I'll say to them, so what solutions do you think there are to this? And then someone will say, we need to present more often, we need to do this, we need to do that. And what I will then do is I will steer them to the point where I'll say, have you ever thought of using a coach as someone who can coach you through these challenges? And that'll stop someone, and someone will say, no, we haven't. And I'll say, well, I happen to have been working with a couple of companies that have got in a coach, and that's made a huge difference to their performance, because it's just someone who listens to them and helps them through the process of understanding what they're grappling with. So those are the sorts of techniques that we use.
Yeah, that word communication, I suppose that comes up as one of the suitcase words that gets written on cards in your sessions. No communication in this company, or we don't communicate, yes, or whatever. And they stick that on the board. And communication is so wide. I can think of just a few things. Normally it's interpreted as, he doesn't listen well, or he never tells us what's going on, or it's both of those things, and it's also the way you communicate. Balancing, or rather managing the tension between empathy on the one side, that's listening to people, and assertiveness, and how do you speak.
Absolutely right. It's also, obviously, as we evolve and change in business, one of the key things that people are grappling with and battling with is the fact that people still see life as about getting a job. And the moment you say, my life is about getting a job and getting paid a salary, the only thing that matters then is that someone tells you what to do, because you're now going to be a robot. As opposed to the kind of world we live in now, where managers are saying, I need someone who can actually think about this. And rather than me having to tell them what to do, I need them to come and tell me what they can do and what they'd like to do. That's the challenge, because this whole business of, I don't know where we're going, I don't know what we're doing as a business. What management would really like is for someone to go away and say, I've thought about this. Why don't we try this or do this way? It would make a huge difference in business.
I had a guy, probably several people, but one specifically comes to mind, where I was coaching him, and everybody comes to him, and they're bugging him for information. They want decisions from him all day. They're coming for decisions. So I said, what do you do then? He says, well, tell them what to do. So that's why they keep coming to you, no?
Yeah.
So I said, remember, your job is not to have all the answers, it's to have all the questions. So
that's
what you
right.
should do is, well, what have you tried? That's what you should say. What have you tried? What possible solutions are there to this problem that you brought to me? Name 3 of them. Give me the advantages and disadvantages of each.
Absolutely.
Then tell me which one you suggest. Don't come here, boss, what should I do? That's one of the kinds of things I mean by communication. That used to be a discipline when I first started working. years ago.
Yeah,
That was the way you did things.
That's right, but it seemed to fall out of use. And part of what caused that is that I think with the new millennials now, they're not going to be loyal to a company. So they move quickly. So what happens is the middle manager becomes the person under pressure. They're the go-to person. So everybody comes to the middle manager and says, help me, I need this. And of course, he hasn't got time now to help the person, empower the person to help them understand. He also is under pressure from top management who's saying, give me this report, tell me about this. And so they're under huge pressure. So, of course, time disappears, and they think the quickest and easiest way to do it, I'll just tell you what to do. And that ends the conversation.
For those groups looking to go out and do strategic planning sessions, and especially the leaders, what should the output be of a strategic planning session?
The ideal is obviously some sort of roadmap that tells you the way forward. And all we're doing in the strategic planning session is understanding what we have at our disposal. So that's understanding maybe what the road looks like ahead, understanding what our resources and capabilities are, and then making some decisions about what we need to do to go forward, and then translating that into an action plan, which consists of the kind of steps we've got to take, how we'll take them, who will make the decisions and make that happen, what are the deliverables, by when have they got to be delivered, etc. And in this way, you've got some kind of a plan going forward. Then the leader's job is to make sure that actually happens. So he's got to call for meetings every now and again and say, how far are we on this track and what's happening?
So many companies start off with what they call a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. The first two being relative to the internal organization and the opportunities and threats coming from outside, like regulation, market forces, economy. Is that an important part?
It is important because it creates a context. It gives you an understanding of where you're at and what you're doing. Because one of the worries when you're briefing a CEO to do a strategic planning session is his worry is going to be that he's got people in the room who don't understand, who are going to give crazy input. And occasionally you do get it where you might say, so what should we do about this? And if you've got fairly junior staff in the thing, their only comment would be, pay me more, as opposed to trying to understand what the business is trying to achieve. So you need to manage that very carefully, in fact.
So what advice would you give to a leader who decides to facilitate his own team's strategic planning session? What are the pros and cons of doing it yourself?
There's nothing wrong with that if the CEO or the leader can be perceived as neutral. The problem is when the decision maker walks into a session with his team and he says, I'm going to facilitate this workshop, they've all got a doubt in their minds about what is the agenda of this CEO? How am I going to be manipulated? What is he actually trying to achieve? And so they will be constantly concerned about whether they're being steered down a path or not. Can they genuinely state what they feel? So there's always a risk that they're not going to be open and honest in what they tell the CEO or the leader. That would be the disadvantage of doing that. But if he's got the right questions and he genuinely is perceived as neutral and he genuinely shows, then there really shouldn't be a problem. But those are few and far between.
I always say, in my experience of negotiation, one of the things which is obviously very important is to ask questions and to listen to the answers. And it's very difficult to listen when you know from the beginning that you fundamentally disagree. It's the job of anybody who's going to be successful in leadership to listen and show appreciation for what the person is saying, whether they agree or not. They can always say afterwards, look, I understand your point of view and thank you for that, but I absolutely don't agree at all for the following reasons. But the listening part is important.
Unfortunately, today you do get CEOs who won't listen.
Yeah.
In fact, I ran a session for a retail organization. I had about 18 people in the room and they were all sitting facing the boards that I had. And the CEO walked in late and brought his chair and put it right next to me facing his colleagues. So, of course, when I went through the rules of the game and said, we're all equal in this room, everybody's views have an equal standing and importance. And he ignored it totally. He still sat in front of the group. And of course, I asked one of the questions, I can't remember what it was, but it was something to do with, what is your brand promise? What are you really telling your customers? And he said, no, we don't need to tackle that. I know exactly what that is. We don't need to tackle. And I had to say, hold on a sec, can we find out what the group think? He said, no, what the group think is irrelevant. This is what it is. So I had to go through a process and slowly get him to accept that the reason the other people were in the room was to get their opinion. And of course, him having expressed what their brand promise was and what came out of the group was something totally different.
I'm sure a lot of the listeners will identify with what you're saying. That's what their boss would do. So how did you actually manage the process of getting him to be a bit more reasonable?
Well, I let him have his say, and then I was maybe a little bit facetious in saying to the group, you've heard what the boss has got to say. Could you now ignore that, and could you tell me what you think is important? And eventually he got the message and let them have their say. It doesn't happen that often, funnily enough, but it is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And the part of the problem was he didn't give me the brief. It was his general manager who gave me the brief.
So now here's a really general, broad question. I mean, you say you're still doing, at your ripe old age of, 24 now?
77.
You're still doing 40, 50 facilitations a year, and a couple of years ago you were doing 100. From your general observations of what's going on in the corporate and the government landscape, what are the main problems that companies and organizations grapple with?
I think that the issue that will always be a problem is when you're going through tough times, resources are an unbelievable problem. And one of the contradictions that I really grapple with is that on the one hand, we have huge unemployment, and yet on the other hand, there's a massive skill shortage of the right skills. And that, to me, is one of the biggest problems. And good people are easily poached. So what companies are not doing is understanding that 70 to 80% of their people in the organization are actually wanting to leave, are looking for alternative employment. And the only reason they don't move is because there are no jobs out there. So it's a real challenge for people. But there is generally, I find, that there's a grave lack of empowerment of people in the businesses. That's probably the single biggest problem, is that there's no process in the business to help people become empowered and involved and therefore engaged. So people come to work, as far as they're concerned, it's a job. They watch the clock and they wait for 5 o'clock to go home. And that's tragic.
Do you sense a feeling of sort of corporate disengagement, rather be somewhere else, corporate depression?
I haven't thought about it in those terms, but I think that is right. As a CEO, if I was CEO of a large organization, I would be extremely concerned. It must be extremely difficult because you can't motivate people. People have to motivate themselves. Mm-hmm. All you can do is give them the tools, the enablers, and the ability to be able to perform. Now they've got to have the passion and the desire to make things happen. Certainly in the workshops I run, there's a huge apathy in people. They're almost saying, well, it doesn't matter what I say, the boss is going to tell me anyway what's got to happen. Mm-hmm. And the boss is doing that because he's trying to cajole them into actually getting some performance in doing something. So it's a real chicken egg situation. And I think the more articles I read nowadays, the more I see the need for coaching and guiding people and helping managers understand these problems because they're too close to the wood to see what's happening.
So people need to, especially managers, need to involve their staff, and your process certainly helps. I mean, not only are they now feeling more important because their inputs are being received, but they might also be allocated to one of the project teams to deal with some of the action plans which arise. And, basically, I think the message to leaders of organizations or teams should be lighten up.
Yeah. No,
involve your people.
Yes.
That's why they're there. They're a team. You can't do everything on your own. Anyway, Peter, thank you. Do you have anything to add before we close the session?
Derek, I appreciate the opportunity to chat to you, and I have a huge respect for your skills and knowledge in the marketplace of things like negotiation, management, facilitation. And I think that the only message I really would give people, and you would do the same, I'm sure, is it's really about understanding that if you want to master something, and Malcolm Gladwell said this, I think, in his book Outliers, you put in the hours. It's about practice, getting it right. And people should be identifying opportunities and finding a tool or technique and just using it and getting the practice. And then they won't do the practice unless they have a passion for it. And if you've got a passion for something, then what happens is it opens up your curiosity and you start asking questions. That's something, funnily enough, that I've learned from you, is that's exactly what you do. You get really caught up in something, you love what you're doing, and you ask all the right questions to keep it alive. And that's really what life is about. We ultimately all just want choices in life.
Peter Thomas, thank you very much for your time. Now, to the listeners, if you want to get in touch or ask a question, which we'll be glad to deal with in a future episode, just leave a message on the website or send me an email at derek@derekpeed.org. That's DEREK@DEREKPEAD.org. Thank you very much. And as you might have guessed, I'm Derek Peed, and this has been Not Just Business. Enjoy your day.